Okay, so we'll get started, and I'll respect the half-hour time limit. I may not totally finish, and if I don't, I'll continue on the next time. And so just a couple of notes about just the class work. So I had marked these international product launches and was able to send back some detailed comments. Um, so if you did that, that'll help raise your mark. Just a couple of notes. Um, I'm looking at the first line of the instruction, and it says to select a Canadian product or service. So if you pick a country that's not Canadian, you're at a disadvantage already. Now, maybe you make an excellent, report on why Coca-Cola should expand to a new part of the world, but unless you're really, really excellent, if you're not picking a Canadian company, it's not going to go as well. And also another one, select, oops, go back here, select a market where the product is not currently available. So if it's already for sale in that area, like if you're saying, okay, well, I'm going to select Canada Goose and I'm going to select the United States as my market, well, it doesn't quite meet criteria number three. So you're going to be at a bit of a disadvantage. And I even ran into a couple of cases where people said, therefore, at the end of the report, the product should be sold in Canada. And I think, if you just did a little bit of a proofread, you'd realize, or you could even send it to me as a draft and be like, is there an issue here? And I could say, unfortunately, you didn't clearly indicate what your country was, and you didn't prove why that Canadian company should expand in that country. I could tell you something like that, but please proofread these things. So, and then, for this week, our little 30-minute task is to give a motivational talk to a friend using some of the theories that we discussed last class. So, ethics and business ethics, if I get to the case study, it's about a company called BRIX, where billions of dollars were lost and people lost their lives. So to show you why this is a serious issue, but it can also just affect the day-to-day issues. So, basically ethics, I was at a school, Northview, with a lot of ESL students. So we talked about, should you jaywalk to go to Tim Hortons and Starbucks as your ethical situation? So here's the Starbucks that I see, near North Toronto. So would I cross the street, or should I go to the light? Some people will go to the light no matter what. Some people will cross the street if no one's looking or it's not busy. What if I saw Mr. Mac? Would that change what I'm going to do? Um, it's not necessarily, not a clear right or wrong answer. Like, you could jaywalk and you're not going to get arrested there, but some people will choose not to do it for their own reasons. Maybe most days you don't jaywalk going to lunch, but that one time you're late, you rush things. So these are kind of these ethical dilemmas. They're these gray areas that you know affect how we act, and there's not necessarily a right or a wrong answer. And this could include things like companies that don't pay their full taxes. Businesses want to be profitable, but sometimes businesses go too far, and they'll, for example, Apple tries to funnel all their European sales through Ireland because Ireland has the lowest tax rates. However, they didn't actually sell those iPhones in Ireland. They sold them in Spain, and they just created a head office in Ireland to lower their taxes. Is that right or wrong? We have issues like privacy, like those you see Mark Zuckerberg is testifying because Facebook shared data. We have Nike and their sweatshops. We have cigarettes that are targeted towards young people, even though it's unhealthy. There's, all these kinds of situations, that aren't necessary. There's not a clear right or wrong answer. In some countries, you know, in Vietnam, it's okay to not pay the same wage that you do in Canada. But does that make it right or wrong? Businesses have to decide that. So An example, one of the terms for today is corporate social responsibility. So the concept that businesses should be responsible for the well-being of society, not simply their own profits. So you might see Patagonia. They were in this book I was reading, Extreme Teams, because they have turned down some opportunities to make more profit because they want their coats and their clothing to be more sustainable. That everyone who works there strongly believes that the company should help out the rest of the world and not just make a profit. And you might see little examples like, well, we were not going to Starbucks as much as we used to the last couple of months, but no more plastic straws. After that video with the turtle that got the straw stuck in them, a lot of companies have been finding a way to either use reusable straws or paper straws or some other thing that leaves less of an ecological footprint. So there's sort of two different ways you can look at ethics. And one of them is sort of a top-down approach. And that's if you have like these big rules, like, don't steal is a big, overarching rule. So then the person who's in the office and is like, well, should I take, these pens home because I need some pens at home? It's no big deal. If they were doing the top down approach, they'd say, you know what, don't steal is an important rule. I'm not going to, uh, do anything here. So, a top down approach, can be things like the 10 Commandments, the Golden Rule, treat others the way you want to be treated, other, big, serious principles people have. And if they extend those all the way throughout the company, that would be more of a top-down approach. So that person who is thinking about taking some office supplies home, they'd be like, the 10 Commandments, they say don't steal. That applies here. I'm not going to take the office supplies home. Or there's like more of a bottoms up approach, which is we look at, I guess I missed that slide. We look at each case, and you'd be like, okay, well, I do need a couple of pens at home. I have to work at home every now and then. I need some pens and a notebook to do my work. It's not that big a deal. Yeah, I might personally use them, but within the context of the situation, it's okay. So a bottoms up approach would be you look at the details of each situation and sort of evaluate them separately. So, ethics, rules that are to tell us the difference between what's right and wrong. So what if you found a wallet on the street? Would you return it? Would you leave it? Would you take it? These are all things that you can do. It's a found item. There's no, you're not going to get, arrested if you take the wallet and don't return it, but you would know. So kind of we're all going to have these little rules that help us tell the difference between right and wrong. And the same thing applies in business. It's like, well, should we properly dispose of these chemicals, or is it okay to dispose it wherever? Values, again, do you have any principles like, okay, our company really values honesty. Therefore, it's okay to have a whistleblower. Or our company really values, Patagonia, our company really values sustainability. Therefore, any product we make must be long lasting, must be made in an ecologically responsible way. And, so these values are sort of these big principles. Sometimes you might have heard of Volkswagen. They were making cars in Europe, but they falsified the emission tests. The cars actually were not environmentally safe, and the cars did not meet the criteria to be sold in Europe, but they falsified the records to make it seem like they were low emission cars. So that would be, contrary to the value of honesty or integrity. And then, we have our own rules to decide what's good or bad. And so here's my bottoms up approach. So we focus on the daily behavior of employees by creating a culture or discussing case studies. So, you encourage everyone, if you encourage everyone to donate to a charity, once a week, or everyone at the company decides to go to the Sporting Life 10K to raise money for a certain cause, or you treat the customers with respect every day, or you look at things individually, well, what about this case? Well, it's all right, it's just a small thing, or for the most part, doing this will help the company. So bottoms up as you look at the individual cases and weigh the merits of it. So, I'd ask you the question, what's ethical behavior when no one's watching? The first time I came to North Toronto and I was reading the graffiti, there was an article about how e-learning courses were having trouble with the integrity of their non-proctored evaluation. And people were paying for others to write their essays, or other people were taking the test. Having taught this course now, I've seen duplicates of projects that are online that have been submitted 2 years ago, and they get flagged, or I see something that matches a database. But if you were taking an online course this summer, how would you act if no one was watching? That's kind of your ethical behavior. And you don't have to say that because it's highly personal, but even students, you have some ethical behavior. You might not think you do. It could be even just setting an example for a younger sibling, but you do have younger, ethical behavior does apply to you. So the second key term, if the first key term was corporate social responsibility, um, the second key term is an ethical dilemma. And that's a choice where there's no real clear right or wrong. There's no clear legal, answer to it. But businesses face these all the time, and we want to encourage you to handle them in a clear way. So what I'll do is I'll show you a bit of an ethical dilemma with a Canadian company called BBI2O. And this happened in the 90s. Has anyone heard of BBI2O? BRE-X. It's a little strange name. For a period of time in the 90s, it became like the biggest Canadian company. Like, it was this small mining company in Indonesia, and it became one of the biggest Canadian companies in the world, and it all sort of collapsed. The reason it collapsed was it was founded on, some false records. And so I'm showing this to you so you sort of understand what can go wrong if there's an ethical dilemma that's not handled correctly. So, they found a junior mining company. If you hear the name junior mining company, it just means it's recently created and it's small. Like Barrick Gold is a big gold mining company in Canada. A gold mining company that started up last year is a junior mining company because they're just a little smaller. So they found some samples in Borneo, and they thought that there'd be 200 million tons of gold, and that would be one of the biggest gold mines in the history of the world by a long shot. It'd be one of the biggest ever. And it was a penny stock, meaning it literally was trading for 3 or 4 cents a share, and it went up to $256 a share in 1996. So, and then it turned out that the samples were falsified. The stock price crashed a year later, and the company formally dissolved in 2002. And this was all over the US business news as well. So people lost a lot of money. Here you see on Time Magazine how investors got fleeced. Well, how was it that they got fleeced? So firstly, a bit of a, when no one's watching, this guy, Michael de Guzman, is a prospector. He's in Indonesia. He's in the rainforest. He's by himself. It's a very, very small operation. And what he did was he had a wedding ring that was gold. And he had his gold wedding ring. and he's exploring an area. And the way they do it is they, dig up small samples of areas that are promising and analyze how many bits of pieces of gold there are in it. And if there's a certain ratio, it means they should dig more. Now, they don't just find like a huge nugget of gold, they find little pieces of gold. And in fact, they even find flecks of gold, and that indicates there might be more metals later on. So he shaved his wedding ring and kind of, took a razor blade and shaved off pieces of his wedding ring into the soil sample so that when they analyzed it, they're like, whoa, there's a lot of flecks of gold in this. This is pretty promising. This looks good. And so in 1993, there started to be some good some good news about this company, some buzz. And that's the guy, Michael de Guzman. So then the next step, they had to do a big cylinder. They had to drill out a big cylinder to sort of prove that there was more gold there. And so a wedding ring wouldn't cut it anymore, because we're talking like meters in length and like a huge cylinder with a big drill. So what he did was he went to some of the people who were mining gold in the river, like some of the local Indonesians. They were using pans to see what metals were in the river, and he bought gold from them and mixed it into the cylinder that they had drilled out. So again, people were looking at it and they were saying, "Hey, it looks good here. There's a lot of gold in this big cylinder. This means that there's probably, according to our formulas, probably a big gold mine nearby." Now, one thing they do in mining to prevent this from happening is they do 2 cylinders to confirm. In this case, the second cylinder mysteriously disappeared and couldn't be checked for confirmation. So they just had half the test results. So in 94, again, positive news. Now they just can't start drilling right away because it takes a while to get the equipment there to set things up. So in 95, some auditors said, "Hey, this doesn't make sense. These results seem funny. They're not like other test results we found before." And de Guzman said, no, that's because there's this volcanic pool theory. So how could you protect yourself from an ethical situation like this, from being the victim like these investors are, is to just stop and use your head. Like when the auditors say it doesn't make sense and the company has some weird theory no one's ever heard of before, that's probably a good sign that, it's not, something's not right. So 95, there were some of the signs that things weren't going right, but the company kept growing. And then, they started doing some bigger drilling. Here's some of the drilling that's underway. And as the stock climbed, the founders of the company, they sold their options, meaning they sold their stock options, their options to buy stock later on for 100 million. You might recall the price earlier. It was worth more than this, but they kind of got out early, so they didn't get the highest price, but they still got $100 million. And again, that's another, sign, hey, here's what a real share looked like in the 90s. When the founders of the company are trying to get out, again, something might not be right. Now, maybe one person, if there's 3 people on Dragon's Den, they go and pitch the company, they get the investment, one person leaves, something like that's natural, but everyone trying to get out, again, would be a little suspicious. So what happened next? So it's trading in Alberta. A suspicious fire destroys all the records at the mining site. Again, no one knows why. The Indonesian government saw, hey, this is a big opportunity. Let's get in on this. And they seized what I want to say, 40% of it. BRIX got 45% of it, and another company, Freeport Moran, a US company, had 15%. Again, because a small company like BRIX wouldn't have the equipment to fully mine this big company, so they had to get a third company involved. So, hey, it's not as good as it was in 96, but 45% of $1 billion is still pretty good. So here you can see it's trading on the Alberta Stock Exchange. There it is on the ticker, BRIX, and it's about 158 right now. So Freeport Moran, they get brought in, they drill their own samples, and because they're not salting it like that guy Michael de Guzman was, they discover there's no gold. So they're like, hey, wait a minute, and they have a meeting scheduled. On the way to the meeting, Michael de Guzman mysteriously fell out of a helicopter into the Indonesian jungle. So who knows what was happening there? I mean, that seems like he probably was silenced. So again, this is why ethical situations are serious. People are starting to lose their money, and someone's lost their life. And there's the jungle. So after a second report was published and it confirmed that the samples had been tampered with, the stock plunged from hundreds to 8.5 cents a share. 40,000 investors lost $3 billion. So here you can see the stock price, the initial auditor's report, and initial auditor's report, it loses a lot, and then it loses the rest once the second report comes out. So again, all that money was lost. $3 billion, people's retirements, people's savings, all because somebody was creating a scam. You might hear the term stakeholders, and this would be the third thing that I want you to get from today's class after CSR and after ethical dilemma is stakeholders. That's the people who are affected by the company. So here we have, there's primary stakeholders, which are people who have a financial interest in the company. And then there are secondary stakeholders. They're still affected by the company, but they don't have a financial connection to it. Like, for example, the community. So in Indonesia, the nearby community where the mine was going to happen, they're a secondary stakeholder. They don't benefit if the mine gets developed, but having a mine in the area would affect them. Maybe if we're talking in North America, the media or the government gets involved, but again, they don't have a formal connection to the company. Who were the primary stakeholders in BRIX? Well, there were anyone who worked for them. They're going to lose their job. They have a financial connection to them, and now they're going to lose their job. The management, those guys, David Walsh, they had criminal prosecutions against them. Any banks that lent them money, they're going to be affected by this because they have a financial relationship with BRIX. Shareholders, they lost $3 billion. So all these people who were investing in BRIX, they were primary stakeholders. So when the ethical situation happened and the fraud was uncovered, they were all affected. So we have people who are affected by the situation. So the primary stakeholders have a financial connection, and the secondary stakeholders don't have any kind of a connection. So about 5 minutes. So that this is sort of good information to know. So let's say a condo was going to go up next to your house starting in 2021. So who are the primary stakeholders? Well, the owners of the company, the management of the company, any suppliers that are going to deliver building supplies to that condo, the labor unions, the construction workers, any investors in that condo, any people who the customers, the people who are going to rent the condo. So they'd all be primary stakeholders because they have a financial connection to it. But there's other people who'd be affected. The community, you'd be affected by having a construction site next to your home for 5 years. Maybe there is, the North Toronto's nearby, and it causes a traffic jam for people getting to school every day. Again, North Toronto wouldn't have a financial relationship with that company, but, the big construction site would affect them. Maybe there's a special interest group that's concerned about the impact of too much construction and pollution. anyone who might be affected with the condo would be a secondary stakeholder. So primary stakeholders, they're financially connected and they're going to do well if the company does well. Secondary stakeholders do not have that business relationship, but they're still affected. Okay, so I just said that. So companies collapse. David Walsh, he died in 1998 in the Bahamas. John Felderhoff, another founder, now lives in the Philippines. He hardly has any money left. Nobody went to jail over this. All the class action lawsuits, the money was spent on legal fees and no one recovered their money. So that $3 billion literally evaporated by the time all of this was done. Here's what the company headquarters looked like. And, you know, it, um, it actually continued on until 2014 because some other mining industry players, they thought, maybe there's still something there. Maybe there's not as much gold as they said, but maybe there's still a little bit of gold there, and people tried to invest in it. Lawsuits over the site continued until 2014. People were criticizing the regulators, the people who were supposed to check on BRIEX and make sure that it was a well-run company so that it could trade on the Toronto Stock Exchange. They didn't do their job. So all this criticism continued for like 20 years after the company went bankrupt. And if you wanted to read more, there's a show called Masterminds that investigated all the little details about the fraud. And this one here, I won't show it because our time's limited, but this is one of the investors. So to put a face on who lost all the money here, it was sort of some of these older investors who were trying to retire with some security. And it did inspire some changes, but for the people like this woman, they ended up losing their money. So if you wanted, I uploaded an infographic in our classroom that has a few more of the events and a little more detail than what I was able to tell you in this short presentation. So if the idea of this interested you, then there's an infographic in our classroom. So hopefully that shows why these ethics are important. And then going forward, we'll explain what to do when there's an ethical situation. So I want to get out of Prezi. I'll close this little guy. And so I think for today that I'm good. I had put some questions in here if we were teaching the class in 407. These are some ideas of ethical situations. So if you weren't quite sure on what kind of an ethical situation would be, you could go to slides 18 to 22. These things, operate something you're not trained to do. What should you do? Should you just go ahead and do it because it's your boss? Or should you apply a top-down approach and be like, wait a minute, I don't know how to do this. This is unsafe. And next class, we'll talk about exactly what to do when a business comes into an ethical dilemma. So that's sort of the idea. Now, you might think, well, who would get hurt by having, like who was hurt by the guy shaving his wedding ring into the gold sample in the middle of the forest in 1993? Well, he ended up passing away. Billions lost. There was fires. People lost their retirement money. Sort of that small action turned into a big situation. So the reason when we warn you about these ethical situations is when they can hurt people, and when they do blow up, they tend to be very bad for the company. So that's sort of my half hour for today. If you need, something to do, I'll show you, I'll go back to our classroom. And what you can see is, the little 30-minute task for this week. motivate a friend. There's two different situations there. Remember our motivation class, you can do that. And then secondly, if you finished that, I posted one called um, list the stakeholders in an ethical dilemma. So you could read it and you could list who the people who are connected. If you remember when I went over that little, like a little statement. So with COVID-19, there's been some controversy at Amazon plants, like should they be cleaned? Should they be closed? Are the workers being paid enough? Are the workers, looked after? And you could state who the stakeholders were. Now, for those of you who need to improve your mark, um, I was going to have a more multimedia assessment for this, but I don't think that's going to work given that we're all apart. So if you would like to do the assessment for this ethics unit, the actual report is called the Conflict Minerals Case Study. It's about all the ingredients that go into our phone, and you can read read a bit about what goes into your phone and then make a plan about how you would act. So if you that's going to be due at the end of May. So that's what I posted. If you need to boost your mark and you want to do the summative assessment for the ethics unit, that's what you can do. Otherwise, our weekly task is motivate a friend, and then our next class is Monday at 10 o'clock. Um, Anyone have any questions? You guys are good about corporate social responsibility, ethical dilemmas, and what a stakeholder is. If you can show the thumbs up, and then I'll stay in here if there is one-on-one questions you have about the class. And then we'll see you on Monday at 10. Have a good weekend, everyone.